On December 18, 1972, the night sky over Hanoi erupted into a nightmare of surface-to-air missiles, tracer fire, and exploding aircraft. In just 11 days, American carrier-based naval aviators would fly into the most heavily defended airspace in the history of warfare, facing more anti-aircraft guns and missiles than existed in all of Nazi Germany during World War II. This was Linebacker Two, the final hammer blow of American air power in Vietnam, and the carrier forces of the United States Navy would prove that naval aviation could bring a determined enemy to the negotiating table. But the road to this moment was paved with blood, sacrifice, and hard-learned lessons that transformed carrier warfare forever. The story of the Linebacker Campaigns begins not in 1972, but 7 years earlier when the first carrier aircraft rolled off the decks of Yankee Station in the Gulf of Tonkin. To understand the triumph of Linebacker, we must first understand the frustration, the losses, and the evolution that came before. The Vietnam War would become the crucible in which modern carrier aviation was forged, where tactics were written in the contrails of dogfights and the smoke of burning aircraft, where young pilots learned that courage alone was not enough against a sophisticated air defense system backed by Soviet technology and North Vietnamese determination. Yankee Station was a point in the Gulf of Tonkin, roughly 100 miles off the coast of North Vietnam, where American aircraft carriers would spend months at a time launching and recovering combat missions. From 1964 to 1973, this patch of ocean became one of the most important pieces of real estate in American military operations. The carriers rotated in and out, but the station remained constant, a floating airport that never closed, never retreated, and never surrendered control of the sea. The carriers that served on Yankee Station were not just ships. They were floating cities of 5,000 men, carrying squadrons of fighters, attack aircraft, reconnaissance planes, electronic warfare birds, and tankers. The USS Kitty Hawk, USS Constellation, USS Enterprise, USS Coral Sea, USS Midway, USS Oriskany, USS Ranger, USS America, USS Saratoga, USS Hancock, and USS Bonhomme Richard all took their turns on station. Each carrier brought approximately 70 to 90 aircraft, and together they would launch more than 100,000 combat sorties during the course of the war. Life aboard a carrier on Yankee Station was a unique blend of monotony and terror. For weeks, the daily routine would be the same. Launch aircraft, recover aircraft, maintain aircraft, sleep if you could, and do it all again. The flight deck was the most dangerous workplace in the world. Men worked in a ballet of controlled chaos, where one mistake could mean death from a jet intake, a spinning propeller, or a misstep into the ocean. The heat was oppressive, the noise was deafening, and the hours were endless. But when the call came for a strike package to launch, every man knew that some of those pilots might not come back. The early years of the air war over North Vietnam were marked by optimism and strict rules of engagement that frustrated the aviators who had to follow them. Operation Rolling Thunder, which began in March 1965, was supposed to be a gradual application of air power that would convince North Vietnam to stop supporting the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. Instead, it became a 3-year campaign of restricted targets, political limitations, and mounting losses. Carrier aviators found themselves flying into heavily defended areas to strike targets of questionable value, while prohibited from attacking the most important strategic targets like airfields, ports, and power plants near Hanoi and Haiphong. The North Vietnamese Air Force flying Soviet-supplied MiG-17, MiG-19, and MiG-21 fighters quickly learned to exploit the American rules of engagement. They would take off from airfields that American pilots were forbidden to strike, attack American strike packages, and then flee back to the sanctuary of their protected bases. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese integrated air defense system, directed by Soviet advisors and equipped with the latest SA-2 surface-to-air missiles and thousands of anti-aircraft guns, turned the skies over North Vietnam into a deadly gauntlet. The SA-2 guideline missile was a game-changer. Standing 35 feet tall and carrying a 350-pound warhead, it could reach altitudes of 60,000 feet and speeds of Mach 3. When it detonated, it sent shrapnel in all directions, capable of shredding an aircraft. The missiles were controlled by ground radar sites that could track multiple targets simultaneously. American pilots learned to watch for the telephone pole-shaped missiles as they climbed toward them, waiting until the last moment to brake hard and hope the missile could not turn quickly enough to follow. But the SA-2 was not designed to necessarily hit aircraft. It was designed to force them low, into the range of the anti-aircraft guns. Below 10,000 feet, the sky belonged to the guns. The North Vietnamese employed an estimated 7,000 anti-aircraft guns of various calibers, from small 23mm guns to massive 100mm cannons. The most feared was the 85mm gun, radar-directed and deadly accurate. At medium altitudes, these guns created a curtain of steel that could tear an aircraft apart. Pilots described flying through flak as like being inside a thunderstorm where every lightning bolt was trying to kill you. The tracers you could see represented only a fraction of the rounds being fired. For every tracer, there were 4 or 5 rounds you could not see until they punched through your aircraft. The aircraft carrier air wings of the early Vietnam period were equipped with a mix of aircraft, each with specific roles. The F-4 Phantom was the primary fighter, a big, powerful twin-engine beast that could carry enormous loads of bombs or air-to-air missiles. The A-4 Skyhawk was the light attack bomber, small, nimble, and beloved by its pilots for its toughness and reliability. The A-6 Intruder was the all-weather attack bomber, capable of striking targets at night or in bad weather with sophisticated navigation and bombing systems. The A-7 Corsair II joined the fight in 1967, bringing improved range and accuracy to the light attack role. The F-8 Crusader, the last of the gunfighters, provided air superiority with its built-in cannons and missiles. Supporting these combat aircraft were RA-5 Vigilante reconnaissance jets, EA-3 and EA-6 electronic warfare aircraft, E-2 Hawkeye early warning planes, and KA-3 and KA-6 tankers for aerial refueling. Naval aviators quickly learned that the training they had received did not prepare them for the reality of combat over North Vietnam. Air-to-air combat training had atrophied since the Korean War, and most pilots had never practiced dogfighting. The F-4 Phantom had been designed as a missile platform and did not even carry an internal gun. When American pilots found themselves in close-range turning fights with nimble MiG-17 fighters, they discovered that their missiles often failed to track or detonate, and they had no gun to fall back on. The result was an unacceptable kill ratio in the early years of the war. Something had to change.
In 1968, the Navy established the Navy Fighter Weapons School at Naval Air Station Miramar in California. It would become known as Topgun. The school took the lessons learned in combat over North Vietnam and created a rigorous training program that taught pilots how to dogfight, how to employ their weapons effectively, and how to survive against a determined enemy. Instructors, many of whom had combat experience in Vietnam, flew aircraft that simulated the performance of MiG fighters. They pushed students to their limits, teaching them that fighting was not about following a checklist, but about understanding energy management, angles, and the split-second decisions that meant life or death. The impact of Top Gun on the air war would not be fully realized until the Linebacker Campaigns, but it represented a fundamental shift in how the Navy approached air combat. The bombing halt of 1968 brought a temporary end to strikes against North Vietnam, though carrier aircraft continued to fly missions over Laos and South Vietnam. For nearly 4 years, the carriers remained on station, but the intense air war over the North was on hold. During this time, the Navy refined its tactics, improved its aircraft, and trained a new generation of aviators who would soon face the ultimate test. By 1972, the situation in Southeast Asia had changed dramatically. American ground forces were being withdrawn as part of Vietnamization, the policy of turning the war over to South Vietnamese forces. The North Vietnamese, sensing an opportunity, launched the Easter Offensive in late March, sending massive numbers of troops and tanks across the demilitarized zone and out of sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos. The South Vietnamese forces, despite years of American training and equipment, began to crumble under the assault. President Richard Nixon, facing a presidential election and determined not to lose Vietnam on his watch, ordered a massive air response. The carrier forces on Yankee Station were about to go back to war against North Vietnam, but this time with fewer restrictions and better tactics. Operation Linebacker 1 began on May 9, 1972. Unlike Rolling Thunder, Linebacker had clear objectives: destroy North Vietnam's ability to wage war by striking transportation networks, fuel storage, power plants, and military installations. The targets that had been off-limits for years were now authorized. On the first day of Linebacker 1, Navy aircraft from the carriers Coral Sea, Kitty Hawk, Constellation, and Midway struck targets in and around Haiphong Harbor, including the mining of the harbor entrance to cut off North Vietnam's supply line from Soviet and Chinese ships. The mining operation was a masterpiece of precision. 6 intruders from multiple carriers flew at low altitude and dropped Mark 52 mines in the shipping channels. These mines were programmed to activate after a certain period, giving foreign ships time to leave the harbor. But once activated, they would sink any ship that passed over them. The mining effectively closed North Vietnam's most important port.
Over the next 6 months, carrier aircraft flew thousands of sorties against North Vietnam. The targets included the Paul Doumer Bridge in Hanoi, petroleum storage facilities, rail yards, truck parks, and air defense sites. The Paul Doumer Bridge, which carried the main rail line from China into Hanoi, had been struck repeatedly during Rolling Thunder but never completely destroyed. In Linebacker 1, the bridge was finally dropped into the Red River using laser-guided bombs, a new technology that allowed unprecedented accuracy. The pilot would mark the target with a laser, and the bomb would guide itself to the reflected laser energy. The first use of laser-guided bombs in Vietnam revolutionized strike warfare. Instead of dropping dozens of bombs and hoping a few hit near the target, a single aircraft could put a bomb through a window. The improvements in tactics and technology showed immediate results. Navy F-4 crews, trained at Topgun, began racking up MiG kills at a much higher rate than in the early years. The kill ratio improved dramatically. Pilots used better formations, better communication, and better understanding of their weapons. They flew with situational awareness that the early Rolling Thunder pilots lacked. The combination of radar warning receivers that told pilots when they were being targeted, electronic countermeasures to jam enemy radars, and wild weasel missions that specifically hunted and destroyed SA-2 sites made the skies over North Vietnam more survivable, though never safe. The A-7 Corsair II attack aircraft proved to be one of the stars of Linebacker 1. With its superior range, payload, and navigation system, the A-7 could strike targets with accuracy that earlier aircraft could not match. A-7 pilots developed tactics for low-altitude attacks that exploited terrain masking to avoid radar detection until the last moment. They would scream in at 500 feet, pop up to acquire the target, pickle their bombs, and brake hard to evade the inevitable anti-aircraft fire. It required nerves of steel and absolute confidence in the aircraft and your own abilities. The A-6 Intruder continued to prove its worth as the Navy's premier all-weather bomber. While other aircraft were grounded by weather, the A-6 could find and strike targets in conditions that would keep any other aircraft on the deck. The two-man crew, pilot and bombardier navigator, worked as a team to penetrate North Vietnamese defenses at night and in bad weather. The A-6's digital computer and radar system allowed it to navigate to the target, identify it on radar, and deliver weapons with accuracy that was remarkable for the era. Many of the most heavily defended targets were struck by A-6 crews who understood that the cover of darkness and weather gave them an advantage that was worth the risk. The cost of Linebacker 1 was significant. From May to October 1972, the Navy lost dozens of aircraft over North Vietnam. Some crews were killed instantly when their aircraft were blown apart by missiles or flak. Others ejected and were captured, beginning years of imprisonment and torture in the prison system centered around the infamous Hanoi Hilton. A few managed to evade capture and were rescued by Air Force or Navy search and rescue forces in operations that were themselves acts of incredible courage. The rescue of Lieutenant Harley Hall, who evaded for 13 days in the jungle before being picked up, became legendary. Every loss was felt throughout the carrier air wing, but the missions continued because the strategic goal was clear: force North Vietnam back to the negotiating table. By October, the intensity of Linebacker 1 began to decrease as negotiations in Paris seemed to be making progress. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger announced that peace was at hand, and a bombing halt was ordered for the areas around Hanoi and Haiphong, but the optimism was premature. The North Vietnamese negotiators, believing they could get better terms, began stalling and making new demands. The South Vietnamese government, fearing abandonment, refused to sign the proposed agreement. By December, the talks had collapsed. President Nixon, furious at what he saw as North Vietnamese intransigence and determined to force a settlement before his second inauguration, ordered the most concentrated application of air power in the history of carrier aviation. This would be Linebacker Two.
Linebacker 2 began on December 18, 1972, and would last 11 days with a pause for Christmas. The operational name was different from Linebacker 1. This was not a campaign of weeks or months. This was a maximum effort designed to break North Vietnam's will by destroying everything of military value in the Hanoi and Haiphong areas. The primary striking force would be Air Force B-52 bombers flying from bases in Thailand and Guam, but the carrier forces on Yankee Station would play a crucial supporting role. Navy aircraft would strike airfields to keep MUGs on the ground, suppress surface-to-air missile sites, strike targets in the Haiphong area, and provide search and rescue support for downed airmen. The 6 aircraft carriers on Yankee Station during Linebacker 2, America, Enterprise, Midway, Saratoga, Oriskany, and Ranger, launched round-the-clock operations. The tempo was exhausting. Flight deck crews worked 20-hour days.
Pilots flew multiple missions per day. The maintenance crews performed miracles keeping aircraft flying despite the intense operational pace. The carriers themselves maneuvered constantly to maintain the optimal wind conditions for flight operations, burning fuel at prodigious rates and requiring frequent replenishment from the logistics ships that were the unsung heroes of the operation. The North Vietnamese air defense system, though battered by months of Linebacker One operations, still posed a lethal threat. The North Vietnamese had conserved their SA-2 missiles during the bombing halt and now unleashed them in unprecedented numbers. On some nights, more than 200 SA-2 missiles were fired at American aircraft. The sky over Hanoi became a nightmare of streaking missiles, exploding aircraft, and desperate pilots trying to evade and survive. The Navy's Iron Hand flights, strike packages specifically designed to destroy SA-2 sites, flew into the teeth of the defenses to clear the way for the bombers. A-7 and A-6 aircraft would locate the missile sites, mark them with rockets, and then strike them with cluster bombs and high-explosive bombs. It was incredibly dangerous work. The SA-2 sites were defended by anti-aircraft guns, and the North Vietnamese had learned to use dummy sites and quickly move their missiles to avoid destruction. Navy F-4 fighters flew barrier combat air patrol missions between the strike packages and the North Vietnamese airfields, ready to intercept any MUGs that attempted to attack the bombers or strike aircraft. The MiG threat was real. North Vietnamese pilots, though outmatched by the American fighters, were brave and occasionally lucky. They would attempt hit-and-run attacks, diving through the American formations to fire missiles or guns before breaking away at high speed. The Navy pilots, employing Topgun tactics, maintained disciplined formations and mutual support. They shot down multiple MUGs during Linebacker Two while losing none of their own in air-to-air combat, a testament to the training and professionalism of the carrier-based fighter community. The target list for Navy aircraft during Linebacker Two included some of the most heavily defended installations in North Vietnam. The Phu Quien Airfield, home of the North Vietnamese Air Force's best MiG-21 squadron, was struck repeatedly by carrier aircraft using laser-guided bombs and conventional iron bombs. The runways were cratered, the hangars destroyed, and the support facilities demolished. Haiphong's petroleum storage tanks, rail yards, and military barracks were struck by waves of A-6 and A-7 aircraft. The attacks were pressed home with determination despite intense anti-aircraft fire. Pilots reported walls of flak so thick that it seemed impossible to fly through it, yet they continued to roll in on their targets, pickle their ordnance, and pull out through the fire. The dangers were not only from enemy action. The operational tempo and the complexity of coordinating hundreds of aircraft in a relatively small area of sky led to near misses and the constant threat of mid-air collision. The carrier air traffic control teams worked miracles managing the flow of aircraft, launching and recovering, often in darkness and bad weather. A single mistake could result in an aircraft missing the arresting wires and going into the ocean, or a deck crash that could kill dozens of men and put the carrier out of action. Yet these accidents were remarkably rare, a tribute to the training and discipline of everyone involved. One of the most dramatic moments of Linebacker Two occurred on the night of December 26th, when an A-6 Intruder from the carrier Enterprise was hit by anti-aircraft fire while attacking a target near Hanoi. The pilot, Lieutenant Commander Charles Hunter, managed to keep the aircraft flying long enough to get feet wet over the ocean before he and his bombardier navigator ejected. A search and rescue operation was launched immediately. An Air Force HH-53 helicopter, escorted by Navy A-7 aircraft providing cover and flak suppression, located the crew in the darkness and plucked them from the water, despite being fired upon by North Vietnamese patrol boats. The entire operation, from ejection to rescue, took less than an hour. It demonstrated the commitment that no man would be left behind if there was any possibility of rescue. By December 29th, after 11 days of the most intense aerial bombardment of the war, the North Vietnamese signaled their willingness to return to negotiations without preconditions. Linebacker Two was halted. The strategic objective had been achieved. The carriers on Yankee Station stood down from maximum operations, though they remained ready to strike again if the negotiations faltered. In January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, and the American involvement in the Vietnam War came to an official end, though the carriers would remain on station for several more months to ensure compliance and support operations in Laos and Cambodia. The effectiveness of carrier air power during the Linebacker campaigns was undeniable. The ability to position mobile airfields off the coast, immune to ground attack, and able to operate regardless of weather or political constraints on land bases, proved the enduring value of aircraft carriers. The carriers launched more than 40,000 sorties during Linebacker 1 and 2 combined. They struck targets throughout North Vietnam with an accuracy and intensity that previous campaigns had not achieved. The improved tactics, technology, and training that had evolved over 7 years of war came together in those final months to demonstrate what carrier aviation could accomplish when properly employed. The lessons learned from the linebacker campaigns influenced carrier aviation for decades. The importance of realistic training, exemplified by Topgun, became doctrine. The Navy invested heavily in precision-guided munitions, understanding that accuracy reduced both the number of sorties required and the risk to air crews. The integration of electronic warfare, fighter escort, and strike aircraft into coordinated packages became standard practice. The value of all-weather attack capability, proven by the A-6 Intruder, led to continued investment in advanced strike aircraft. The experience of operating carriers at high tempo for extended periods drove improvements in logistics, maintenance, and personnel management. The human cost of the linebacker campaigns and the entire air war over Vietnam was significant. Hundreds of naval aviators were killed or captured. The prisoners of war who survived years of torture and deprivation in North Vietnamese prisons returned home as heroes, their courage and resistance an inspiration to the nation. The men who flew off the carriers and returned safely carried the memories of lost friends and the weight of their experiences for the rest of their lives. The flight deck crews, maintenance personnel, and ship's company who made the operations possible often received little recognition but were essential to every mission flown.
The aircraft carriers themselves were pushed to their limits. The stress of continuous combat operations, launching and recovering aircraft day and night for months on end, took a toll on the ships and their equipment. Yet they performed magnificently, a tribute to American engineering and the dedication of the thousands of sailors who kept them running. The logistics tail that supported the carriers, the oilers, ammunition ships, and supply vessels that replenished them at sea was equally impressive. Without this support, the carriers would have been forced to leave station regularly, reducing their effectiveness. Looking back at the linebacker campaigns from the perspective of history, several things become clear. First, air power alone cannot win a war, but it can achieve strategic objectives when properly applied with clear goals and adequate support. Second, technology matters, but training and tactics matter more. The same aircraft that struggled in the early years of Rolling Thunder achieved dramatically better results in linebacker because the men flying them were better trained and employed better tactics. Third, the aircraft carrier remains one of the most flexible and powerful tools of national power, able to project force anywhere in the world without requiring permission to use foreign bases. The linebacker campaigns also revealed the limits of air power. Despite the intensity of the bombing, North Vietnam's will to fight was not broken. The country's infrastructure was severely damaged, and its ability to wage offensive war was reduced, but the fundamental political issues that drove the conflict were not resolved by bombing. The Paris Peace Accords that followed Linebacker Two bought time but did not bring lasting peace. Within 2 years, North Vietnam would launch a final offensive that would conquer South Vietnam. American air power would not return to stop it. The carriers that had fought so hard over North Vietnam would watch from a distance as Saigon fell in April 1975. Yet the legacy of the linebacker campaigns and carrier aviation in Vietnam extends far beyond the immediate outcome of the war. The experience gained, the lessons learned, and the capabilities developed would serve the Navy well in the decades to come. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, carriers would be the first American military assets on scene, conducting strikes within days. When terrorists attacked America in September 2001, carriers would launch the initial strikes into Afghanistan. When regional crises erupted, carriers would be there, ready to project power and protect American interests. The men who flew from the carriers during the linebacker campaigns were part of a tradition that stretches from the first carrier raids of World War II to the modern supercarriers conducting operations today. They faced an enemy that was determined, well-equipped, and fighting on their home ground. They flew aircraft that were good, but not perfect, with systems that sometimes failed at the worst possible moment. They operated under rules of engagement that sometimes made no sense and took risks that in retrospect seem almost insane. Yet they flew their missions, struck their targets, and came back to do it again the next day because that was their job and their duty. The Vietnam War was not popular at home, and the men who fought it often returned to a nation that did not appreciate their sacrifice. But the naval aviators who flew from Yankee Station knew they had done their duty. They had proven that carrier aviation could operate in the most challenging environment against a sophisticated enemy and achieve its objectives. They had honored the tradition of naval aviation and passed it on to the next generation stronger than they found it. That is their true legacy.
In conclusion, the Linebacker Campaigns represent the pinnacle of carrier air operations during the Vietnam War. They demonstrated the evolution of tactics, technology, and training over 7 years of combat. They showed both the power and the limitations of air power as an instrument of national policy. They revealed the courage and professionalism of the men who flew the missions and the sailors who supported them. And they proved that the aircraft carrier, that uniquely American weapon system, could deliver sustained combat power anywhere in the world. The lessons learned over the skies of North Vietnam continue to resonate today, reminding us that victory in combat comes not from technology alone, but from the combination of good equipment, sound tactics, realistic training, and above all, the courage and determination of the men and women who serve. The Linebacker Campaigns were not the end of carrier aviation's story, but they were a defining chapter, one that deserves to be remembered and studied by anyone who seeks to understand the history of naval air power and the price of freedom.